Thanks very much, Neil. We haven't really got time for questions. We'll move on to the next speaker.
So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Liz Crowe. She's an advanced clinician, paediatric social worker from Piku and Lady Salento. She has lots of experience in grief, loss and crisis and bereavement, and also has done her PhD in examining wellbeing of critical care nurses in Piku. Can you please welcome her for her presentation?
No, don't worry.
Time stands still.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm going to talk to you about decision-making and leadership in intensive care. And I thought I wanted to start, first of all, by saying we are in the relationship business, and we keep forgetting that. So it's just as Neil just said, you know, if we don't invest in people, we don't have anything. And decision-making and leadership are pivotal to all of that, and yet we pay very little attention to the way that we make decisions. One of the things that I think is important that we don't talk about enough in leadership and in decision-making is a thing called intellectual candor. And essentially what that is the tension between being a vulnerable enough person that we know that we don't know anything, that we're prepared to ask others for help, that we're prepared to talk through things, and also wanting to be credible. And what's drawn you to the field of ICU in the first place is you like to be right. We all like to be the smartest in the room. And you'll see this often in ward round, but more, I think, by the bedside nurse. I'm sure if you are a nurse in ICU, you will have this happen often, where several doctors come to the bedside, you ask for a decision, and what you get is a series of opinions. And then they walk away and are surprised when you haven't followed through on the action, when you actually don't know what the decision was. But everyone present has been arrogant enough to believe that their opinion was the decision that was accepted. And that's a very different thing. Decision-making has to be a conscious, thought-through process. It's not something that just happens because you're the boss or because you're the smartest, because you don't know that you are. And so that's why all of us have to keep a level of intellectual candor about us when we're working in intensive care, and why decision-making has to be conscious. The other thing is that I also think as human nature, what we like to do is when someone brings us as a problem is we want to react to it. Say, we're in control here. We know exactly what's going to happen, when often we don't. We are operating in a field of complexity at all times. That's why we can't copy off the aviation system. They have a plane that weighs approximately the same weight all of the time. The variables are often very similar. That's not how we operate. If we're looking after a child with DKA, that could be a tiny baby right through to a 17-year-old. The variables are constantly changing for us. And so when we're talking about decision-making and we're talking about leadership, and that's not just someone who is the boss, all of us have to take carriage of being leaders at times. We have to be doing it in a conscious way. And yet when someone comes to us about anything, I'm thinking about leaving my partner, you know what you should do? We're very good at shoulding people. You should do this. But it's very rarely the advice we take for ourselves. Because if you're having relationship problems and I come and, try to talk it through with you, you'll be filled with uncertainty. Why? It's much more complex than what I understand as the outsider. There are too many things that I'm not even aware of yet. So when someone comes to us with a question, rather than going straight to decision-making, what the emotionally intelligent person does is responds rather than reacts. And sometimes in the space in between that, there should be some reflection. The really wise leader, when someone asks you a question and you don't know, says, I'll get back to you. Just makes you look like Yoda. We talk a lot about emotional intelligence, and that's not what I'm going to go on about today. But when they're talking about neuroscience and leadership, they're saying there's a new component to emotional intelligence that is going to become more and more prominent as we, belong to this high-paced, high-technology world, and that's attentional intelligence. Where is your attention? Even now, you could be on Tinder while I'm up here, and I don't know. I'm just pretending that you're tweeting something profound about what I'm saying. But it's very hard to get people's attention these days, isn't it? Even your best friends, when you're having lunch with them, they're posting pictures on Facebook about their meal. You know, I say to them, unless you're waiting for an organ, get off your frigging phone. I'm very entertaining. I could be saying something very important. But getting people's attention is very difficult. And when we're trying to make decisions, often our attention is diverted to something else. Someone comes and asks us a question, we're in a meeting, a question is asked, or we're trying to have an outcome. Instead of listening to understand, we all listen to respond. So there's a problem. Oh, I'm going to be the smartest and I'm going to say it first. I'm going to say it first and I'm going to make it in reaction to this because ECMO is the thing that interests me most in the world. Or I'm not going to pay any attention at all because this has got something to do with human factors, blah, 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 and the nurses, blah, blah, blah. So attentional intelligence is going to become more and more important, where we're asking ourselves, when we're making big decisions, when we're in meetings, should we have our phones? Should they be present? Are we really that bloody important that we can't give something our full attention for 40 minutes? If I stood up here now and said, we've just had this fantastic talk and I want you to reflect on the fact that in our unit we have someone who's behaving poorly. And look, it's nothing catastrophic. It's just that no one likes to work with them. They're passive-aggressive. They do this, they do that. Immediately, all of us start to think about what would I do in that situation because I would be able to fix it. I would. Whatever's happening in your unit or with your patient, I can fix that. And we put a big spotlight on it. And whenever we're making a decision about something and we spotlight it, because that's what human nature does to us, we forget to look what is the context around it. And I can guarantee you, just as Neil said, if we went into your unit, we could pick the problems, the people who are problems very quickly, and no one is doing anything about it. We're all experts in hindsight. When we're thinking about decision making, we need to think of it in terms of a frame. And this is where it gets complicated. When we're looking at the neuroscience about how do we actually make decisions. The first is usually based on values. The second and third is learning and memory. We are quite lazy by nature. We love patterns. Who here pretty much follows the same pattern every single morning? You get up, you fart, you go to the toilet, you put the coffee on, you pick up the paper, or you check your emails. We follow the same patterns. Who parks in the same car park every day at the hospital and feels genuinely pissed if someone else has taken it? Our brains like patterns. So often we feel like we're being so innovative about things, but chances are when we're making decisions, we've got such a cognitive bias that we are looking to only talk to people who are going to affirm where we want to get. When we're employing people, we employ people like us. We don't actually want to be challenged. We want people who keep saying, yes, you are correct. And so if we're actually making decisions based on what we already know or what we've already experienced, it's very difficult to do something different. Decisions are actually made on our confidence value of getting where we think we need to be. What am I going to wear to the paediatric dinner tonight? I don't care. Jeans, I'm trying to get laid. Short dress, whatever. It's our confidence level of where that is going to take us next. That's what we're doing. And so now that we're learning more and more about what is the actual neuroscience behind decision making, they say that it sits in the striatum, and I don't need to go on about that, I'm not smart enough, but they say it's driven by three particular things: motivation, adaptation, and routine. And they don't actually act independently. They're a hierarchy that interweave amongst themselves. So whenever we're making decisions, there's a large part of this that is driven by where do we want to go and how do we think we need to get there. So we've stopped exploring and we actually are making a decision based on where we think we need to go. And we are locked into routines that we know very little about. So how does this help us at all in terms of intensive care? For those of you who've never read this, I love the Harvard Business Review. I was glad that Neil was quoting it. I think they put out some of the most fantastic articles that are relevant to our line of work. And so there's this thing, it's called the Cynefin. It's Welsh. It looks like it's Cynefin. It's not. You'll look dumb if you say that. It's Connolly Framework. And what it says is that there are factors that are going on in our lives all the time that we never know are influencing us. We never know what their impact is because it's so ingrained in us. We don't know that it's there. And so in terms of intensive care, this is where we're operating all the time. This is the Connolly Framework that I think is actually quite helpful when we're trying to get to something and we're not sure what the outcome needs to be. So the first is, it's very simple. These are the things that are really clearly evidence-based. It has a very clear cause and effect relationship. We know what the right answer is. Do I need to brush my teeth in the morning? I bloody hope you just said yes in your mind. Yes, we do. Why? Well, we know all the factors. It's a no-brainer. They're the decisions that we don't actually even know that we're deciding on. They believe that we make 20,000 decisions a day. And when I was talking about that framework before, what we have to be very conscious of is that sometimes when we're trying to make decisions, what happens to us is that that cognitive bias kicks in and we think, if only we have enough information, we'll know the answer. Whereas often in very complex decision making, there is no right answer. That's why it's hard. We have multiple choices. There's no amount of information that's going to tell us this is 100% accurate. We are being biased by our own values, our own motivation of where we think we need to go. So there's the simple stuff. That's the best practice, the stuff that we don't need to think of. On the same side sits complicated. Now, that's because simple and complicated, on the whole, they're quite ordered decision making. And in complicated, there is a cause and effect. There won't necessarily be a particular right answer. There'll be several that could still get us to the same destination. And it's about good practice. And in terms of what do, it's a stop, a sense, an analyse and respond. Whereas when we move into the complex, this is where things start to get quite unpredictable and they're flux and things are emergent. And often we are operating somewhere between complex and complicated at all times in the intensive care environment. So what do? You're supposed to probe, sense and respond. And sometimes we can do that with reflection and sometimes we have to do that immediately. And then there is the chaotic. These are the big events that no one can plan for. What happened in Manchester? 9/11. When we look at what leadership does, Rudy, what was his name? Rudy, I can't say it. Giuliani, you know what I'm saying, the mayor of New York, he had to make decisions completely independently at that time. He did a brilliant job of it. He stood up as an outstanding leader. What people needed at that time was stability. And that's what happens in a chaotic environment. The problem is, and this is the struggle for leaders, both in the complex and the chaotic, is that people are looking for leadership, but as you get to a point of stability, you need to go back into the complicated. Otherwise, with Rudy, everyone had loved him. He could do no wrong. And then all of a sudden, a few weeks afterwards, he said, "We're not going to call elections because I think you need the same mayor to take you through." And everyone went, "Hang on a second." And all of a sudden he lost flavour. So what you have to do is work out when do you need to step up and make decisions quite independently because there's too much chaos, and when do you step back? And what good leaders do, particularly in complex situation, is say, I don't have all the answers. Where are my experts? Where's the content knowledge here? Reading the back of a book does not give you content knowledge. Quickly Googling something on Wikipedia is probably not making you an expert. But there are usually people within our systems that can provide that and can provide it quickly. And in this day and age of social media, if we don't have that at our fingertips, it often doesn't take long to find someone else who might be able to assist. So this is something, and I think that when we're really stuck with problems, that it's sometimes all right to matrix them. Not just simply pros and cons, but why is this hard? What would it look like if we made a completely different decision than the one that we've talked about? What could be the outcome then? So decision making is very tricky. It's something we need to do as a much more conscious way of thinking in order to get it right. And the other big thing that we need to think of is that the decision itself is not the end of the story. How often do we sit in meetings where really decisions are made where we know nothing is going to follow through? How often do you go to meetings where the agenda never changes because there's never an outcome? Oh, let's just park that. Let's get back to that next week. Not making a decision is a decision by default. And what it does is it paralyses the intensive care. We're very good often clinically at making decisions, but around the human factor things, around the things that actually count and value and acknowledge people, that will make a difference to how the systems, that's where we get trapped. So, when we're making a decision, we need to ask ourselves, who will actually be affected by this? Who needs to know? How are we going to communicate that? How are we going to get on board? Perhaps one of the steps that I've lost in that is, how will we know if we've made a mistake and how quickly can we change it? Probably just as equally important. Who's going to take out accountability and oversight? And putting something on an agenda is not accountability and oversight. It's just another item on the agenda. What will be the timeframes and who and how will it be reviewed? We can't make decisions based on what the outcome is when we don't know what it's going to be there. And getting to an outcome that's successful does not mean that the decision or the process were the right ones. Sometimes we just got lucky. So, in relation to decision making, in relation to leadership, I think it's critically important to be the kind of leader that you would follow. If you wouldn't follow you, if you don't always trust you with decisions, then look bigger, look broader. Find people who actually complement you in terms of strengths and weaknesses. If you don't know what your strengths and weaknesses are, ask somebody. Self-reflection and emotional intelligence actually should be the greatest drivers of decision making. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz, for a great presentation.